Okay, and let's get started with our part 3 on workflow. And this is all based on the role-based delegation model that exists within AGPM. And so with workflow, it allows us actually to do some operations with a specific flow of approval, a specific flow in general behind this process. So in the end, how does the general group policy management flow looks like? Well, again, as I said, it's based on the specific roles such as there exist 4 in our case with AGPM. We have the full control, which is in general the AGPM admin. He's capable of doing whatever operation from creating the initial group policy object. However, when you would look at the editor role, which is typically a user who can modify, who can edit the group policy, but for example not deploy it in production, well, you would actually delegate specific type of operations to the editor. In the same way that the editor can actually look at the settings, can build the settings within the group policy, but in the end cannot push it out to production. He can be reviewed by a person that has been assigned the reviewer role. However, in the end, when you're really trying to push out these settings to production, it's actually the person that holds the approver role, which has the capabilities of pushing it out to production. Let's have a look. So what we still have here is our console of our administrator, Kurt. Kurt, as you know, is an AGPM admin. But what we're also going to do is we're going to take a second console, which was for our user Rudy. And Rudy is an editor. So in this case, let's assume that Rudy is a junior administrator when it comes down to policies. So we're going to run this AGPM as being Rudy. And now what we're trying to point out here is that Rudy will be capable of doing different things based on his role in regards to Kurt, which is actually the AGPM admin. So in this case we have Rudy with his console. It looks almost very similar. However, remember that Rudy is a editor in this case, whereas Kurt is truly an AGPM admin. Now, in the way what they can do, what operations they can actually do, is already can be seen in a very simple way. When you look at the operation of creating a new group policy object for the GPO admin for Kurt, it looks like this. So let's say this is Kurt's GPO. He has the possibility to create that live in production or create it offline. Again, offline in the archive where it has no impact on production environment, and you can do that based on an existing GPO template as a basis. And one of the examples we created in the previous session was the base security for servers. So let's start with a simple, clean, empty GPO, and there we go. So of course, Kurt here succeeds. After all, he's a GPM and AGPM admin. Now on the other hand, if we actually look at Rudy, he's capable also of creating a GPO. However, do you notice that when he receives the form to build a control GPO, it more looks like a request to create the new group policy object. And that's actually because he's sending out a notification to an AGPM admin, which then is informed about his request for creation. And so, this is Rudy's GPO. It would be sent if at least I complete the email properties on the AGPM application. Again, if it's online or offline, based on an existing or an empty GPO. Next, and there we go. Now in this case it was successful. However, notice one action failed. That is quite simply because we did not configure the mail settings for AGPM, so it didn't know which mail server to send the notification to, it didn't know which people to send the notification to, but in the end I'll show you that in just a second where that will be done. So again, let me point out that what Rudy sees and what Kurt sees is two completely different things, right? Because simply they have different roles, they have different permissions, they have different responsibilities. Now, on the other hand, when you look at Kurt, he's requested to create a policy. More often, he's actually capable of creating it himself. After all, he's an AGPM admin, and straight away it's a controlled GPO. On the other hand, if you would look at Rudy, who requested to create such a policy, which was Rudy's policy, you would not find it in here, because he actually sent a notification. It would actually end up in the pending requests. And so indeed, Rudy requested at a specific time and date to have this Rudy's GPO, group policy object, created. Now, can he do something with that? Not really. The only thing he can do is withdraw his request. Because in the end, what he needs is he needs the approval of a person capable of doing so and doing that operation on the group policy. So in this case, Kurt, he would actually approve or reject the settings that he finds back in this group policy. In this case, it's even an initial create process, so he would approve on that. He would say, okay, go ahead. Okay. So here we go. It now disappears from the pending operations. It has been approved. It actually appears in the control tab. So there he is, Rudy's GPO. And of course, Rudy sees exactly the same. Of course, after a small refresh, that's in the end the same archive we're looking at. So now Rudy is capable of actually going and editing this policy. However, do you notice that before I can edit, I would need to have exclusive access to the group policy. And we do that actually by checking out the policy. So let's say we do an initial checkout, meaning we're going to populate with some settings. At all times the comment is nicely saved as with the version of the group policy. So it's now being checked out to Rudy. Rudy now has exclusive access to this group policy. He can now, for that reason, also edit it. Do you notice that when he edits the policy, it's the same familiar interface that we've used before? And do you notice that version 3 of AGPM supports not only policies, but more importantly also preferences. So you have full support on that. So if we actually have a quick look at some of the settings, let's say we're doing something here with, let's say, the shutdown tracker. Let's go and enable that for servers only. Let's say we're doing something with verbose messages. Just as an example, we're happy with that. And of course, now we will need to check that back in. Now, before I check this in, let me show you from the point of Kurt that he actually also sees this Rudy, but he can actually do nothing except for checking it in. So he cannot edit it. It's exclusively checked out for Rudy. So he can make that, he can undo that. Imagine Rudy is sick, so he can check it back in, so he could edit it, but we're preventing mutual modifications or simultaneous modifications. So Rudy's happy with his changes. He's now checking this back in. Says, okay, checking in. He will then request for a review. So please review. And there we go. So it's now going back into the archive. And there we go. So it's now again available for anyone to check out, including Kurt, who is now also capable of checking it back out and based on that, editing it. Now, of course, Rudy's happy with this. What he would like to do now is actually send this out to production, because he's now requested the policy to be created. It's been approved by Kurt. He's then made the modifications, and he now wants this policy to be deployed in production or pushed out in production. So what would he do? He would right click the policy and would actually go for a deployment. So deploy. Of course, again, the same story. If our junior admin Rudy does that, again, he's notifying an AGPM admin that he wants this operation to take place. So it's a request for deployment. On the other hand, if our friend Kurt would do that, and he would actually deploy, you would see that straight away it would actually go into the deployment process. Okay. So let's follow the chain of Rudy. He's not capable of doing so, but he's going to ask me for OK for deployment. And so he's sending that to Kurt. He will actually review it and then probably is going to deploy that into production. So again, notification failed, as I said before, but the action, most importantly, is that he requested to deploy. So same logic again. It now went into the pending tab. Notice how it's now saying pending deploy. Again, the only thing Rudy can do is withdraw. So the same story is going on for Kurt. He's now seeing this pending deploy operation posted by Rudy at 9 o'clock. So he now would actually approve it. Well, probably yes, but first he wants to know what's inside the policy. So he probably wants to look at some of the settings that live inside a policy. And probably he would like to see about, hey, what has changed in the policy? So in the end, this is quite straightforward. What is in the policy? But what has changed? Because maybe Rudy now suddenly thinks about, hey, hold on, I forgot another setting. So he's now withdrawing. He's now pulling it back, going back into the control environment, saying, damn, there's something actually I forgot about. So he's now checking it back out. Let's do so. Succeeded with that. He's now editing it. And now let's assume that he needs to go back into the setting because he just figured out that, hey, this verbose setting or my shutdown event tracker is not such a good idea. It should be for any machine. He's now doing that. Okay. Small problem there, small issue that he forgot about. He's checking it back in. Finalized. Okay, there it goes. Going back into the archive. Waiting for an OK. And that's great. And so indeed, now requesting for deployments. So again, it's a notification. Final version ready for deployment. And there we go. Again, now went into pending requests. There it is, pending. So the only thing Rudy can do is sit and wait or withdraw his request. But now indeed, Kurt, he's not so happy because in the end he now wants to know what has changed. And he can actually look at different versions that exist of this policy. And so you can see actually here it all started where Rudy requested a creation, where in the end Kurt did approve it and did create it. Every time you see the comments appearing here from this column, in the end it got checked in by Rudy, who's now actually, he's made some changes, and you do notice at that time you actually see the changes coming in. And then of course he requested the deployment, still Rudy, and then of course he actually changed his mind. He withdrawn that request, checked it back in, made some changes that were now final, and then again he requested for the deployment. But of course my initial question is about what did he change in the meanwhile? What did he change between this request and that request before he withdraws? So that's the story of the differences. When I look at the differences, it will actually point out what the differences are between two versions of a group policy object. And this is really what a group policy administrator needs. Because in the differences report you will see three colors. Even though I only see one here, the third color will be the light blue. The light blue is indicating that there was a change. However, the setting is still there, but it's actually value that changed. And indeed, I did change that. Instead of server only, I did change that. Now, on the other hand, the two other colors that you would see would be red and green. So red would indicate removal, setting that was there before but it's now been removed, whereas green would indicate that it's now being added as a new group policy setting. So I can live with that. I think that's not going to harm our environment. So I would approve on that. Approve. Okay. Approved. Now in production. Yes. And there we go. So now what's happened here is that Mr. Rudy, his policy has actually been deployed, approved for deployment, and now really for the first time when you would actually refresh, you would actually see that Rudy's GPO is really popping up for the first time. By deploying, you're really pushing it from the offline archive environment into the production, into the sysvol of a domain controller. Okay. Now there's a second part to this story. Imagine that Kurt wanted to do exactly the same with his policy, with his Kurt GPO. If we actually selected the deploy option, you would see something different though. So I would see in this case that, are you sure you want to deploy? Yes, but there's always also this advanced button. And this advanced button would actually allow me to see if there's any links towards this GPO, towards this group policy object, and if I would like to restore the links. So that's a small difference there, where actually I'm capable of seeing where the group policy is already linked, and if I want to push back these links once I put it in production. Maybe let me show you. So let's assume that you have this GPP, group policy object, and then actually I would like to deploy it into production. First of all, maybe you want to know where it is actually linked, and I can quite easily show you this through the settings again. Settings indicate with the GPO links where currently this group policy object is being linked. So in this case, it's at the laptops OU in the current domain. And so when I actually would redeploy this group policy object into production, I would be capable of requesting it to restore or not restore the links. But when restoring the links, I can even choose if I want it to be restored to that specific OU or the scope to which the policy is actually linked. So I have the option to select all of the locations where it's being where it should be restored, or actually none. So it's quite flexible. And so when doing so, you would now see that this version would again be pushed out into production, into the sysvol, and that's actually linked at the same times to the OU laptops. Okay. Now, what could be the advantage of that is, well, imagine that the group policy got deleted. So let's delete it, not only from the archive, but also from production. So there goes our GPP. It's now being in uncontrolled state, but of course it's also being deleted. So have a look, meaning that it's being deleted from production. When I refresh, there's no more GPP, and for that reason, if I would go into the uncontrolled tab, it would no longer appear there as well. So there's no GPP, because in the end, uncontrolled is referring to the production environment. So what I would do in this case is now go to the recycle bin. And of course, yes, I can actually bring back to life a deleted group policy object. But more importantly, when I do so, I want the links to go back. So it's now being restored, but not in production, of course. We're always working offline. So it's now being brought back into the controlled environment, in which GPP indeed is there. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because if I now actually decide to deploy it back to production, I can actually see to where it was linked, even though in production, if I actually cancel this for a second, even though in production this GPP no longer exists, and of course at this level when I refresh there is no GPP because it does no longer exist. So of course this is now quite powerful. I would actually decide to deploy it as a separate step into production to that specific location where it was linked initially. There we go, it has been restored. It's just pointing out that the order of the links might not be preserved, so that's something to take into account. But the most important thing is that now, of course, the object is coming back when you refresh. There it is. And second of all, when you actually look at it, it is indeed being linked at the laptop SOU. And so indeed, when I look at the laptop SOU and actually refresh in here, you do notice that GPP is there. The only point that it's actually trying to make is that when you look at the link order, that might not be respected. So you might need to maybe change the order in there if there would have been possible conflicts. Okay. Now, as a final step for this fourth part on workflow, it's all about, again, permissions and stuff that you push out into production. Well, what permissions do you push it out with? Well, this is all relating to the tab on production delegation, because every policy, when we push it out to production, when we actually check it into the archive, these are the permissions that we're going to set on them. So if this is not exactly what you want them to be for every policy that you alter through AGPM in production, and you think, hey, in my case, the domain admins, they should only be capable of reading the settings, and I've created this new group which is GPO admins, and they are the true GPO, group policy object admins. Well, you would add them to the list. You would of course make them capable of changing everything, taking ownership, and from this point on, of course, every policy that I would deploy, notice when I deploy it, it would push those settings into production. An example of that is, have a look at GPP. We look at the settings, the delegation that lives on top of it. You don't see any reference towards GPO admin. So when we now would push that out, let's deploy that out again to the initial links as we knew them before. It's also pushing out the security based on the tab that we've just looked at, which is all about production delegation. And for that reason, if we now go back into the GPP, look at the delegation, do notice how the GPO admins are in there. And how in this way it's perfectly possible from the minute that you get information into the archive and put it back outside of the archive into production, that these will be the final permissions. Now that was suddenly there, do notice how actually there's a couple of tabs. Option here has been added, the history. That's a direct reference to the AGPM, showing me all the states of this specific policy, when it's been checked in, when it's been checked out, when there's been changes to it, and the unique versions. And these unique versions, they actually apply directly to the archive control that we had. Remember, where we could decide on how many versions it actually keeps. So if you decided to set this to 25, remember that when you look at a policy, these are the unique versions. If you have 25 entries, well, that's of course because you've decided to only keep 25 entries in the list. Okay, and with this, I hope it was interesting and informative. Thank you.